Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Binkhorst and Blockbusters. I'm Garrett,
And I'm Kate.
and today we're reviewing the Titanic. So let's get right into it because I suspect this will be a long one.
Yeah.
So to get started, what's on TV?
So this week I binged on Independence Day. I binged the new episodes of The Witcher. Season three just came out. So what they did is they released five of the eight episodes. Um, so it's a fun show if you've seen it. I don't want to spoil too much, but the episodes were good. I like it. Garrett, did you watch any of the episodes?
So I watched the first episode, and I really like that they did a good job reintroducing most of the characters and events of the previous seasons, which is something that's, there have been two seasons of this show. There's been a lot of content already, and I didn't really want to rewatch everything to prepare myself for the new season. So I think they did a
Yeah.
good job reminding us who the main players were, introducing some old side characters.
Yeah, this is a show that I like a lot, but the plot is so complicated, and it's so complicated that I had no interest in even watching like a 20-minute recap video on what the heck was going on. So I just went for it, and I think it paid off. I would say that everything was sensical this season, so that's a thumbs up for me.
That's good to hear. Yeah, even though I'm familiar with the games and a little bit about the books, I had a hard time getting into the first season because it didn't really feel that accessible. But the action's really good. That part's really fun. The monsters are cool. Costumes and stuff is all pretty great. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, great CGI, great I think they do a really good job of something that I complain about in fantasy and sci-fi all the time, which is creating an atmosphere. Lord of the Rings is the epitome of creating a great fantasy atmosphere where all the lights golden in the sunny plains and it's dark and blue and dingy in the mines. And I think The Witcher, does have a lot of like great lighting and atmosphere and mood that some of the things like take me out of it, like sequins. I'm like I can't deal with sequins in a fantasy element, but whatever, that's a me problem.
okay. Well, moving on from The Witcher, what is also on TV?
So I just finished The Clearing. I just finished it a couple hours ago. All the episodes are out on Hulu. This is one I would recommend after finishing it all. It did have it did wrap up in such a way that, I'm glad I stuck through it and watched it week to week, and now it's all out, so I can give it two thumbs up for any true crime junkies to go watch this show, binge it. It's only eight episodes, so go for it.
Okay, sounds good. I'm glad we got some closure on the clearing from it appearing in one of our earlier episodes.
Yeah.
So we're moving at a breakneck pace here because we have to talk about the Titanic. Uh, so the
Yeah.
the Titanic is a film from 1996, 1997. It is a big movie. So the runtime, it's over 3 hours. It's very long. It was split onto two VHS tapes. Um, at the time that it was released and made, it was the most expensive film to ever be made. It cost over $1 million per minute of screen time. Uh, the Fox Media conglomerate wanted to shorten the movie by about an hour because 3 hour movies at that time were very difficult to get people into the theaters, and it also ate up so much time at a movie theater that they could show it less, which meant less people could come and see it. So
Yeah.
as a result, they split the costs and profits with Paramount Pictures to kind of like share the weight of it. And they split, international and domestic rights to it. Um,
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point the movie industry did not want this movie to be a 3.5 hour movie. And there are a few movies before this that were on the two VHS tapes. Braveheart's the first one that comes to mind, but um So, but since then, I mean, Lord of the Rings, all the Marvel movies, even James Bond movies are creeping up into 3 hour quadrants now. So I think that's such an interesting change in our like ability to sit in a seat at the movie theater. But it's also that most people, post 2000 are watching movies generally at home. We do see a shift away from the movie theater, and I think that having the 3 hour movies is something that certainly speeds that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Especially when it's at home and you can pause it, it's much better. I paused this movie halfway through so I could go get dinner. So I'm sorry I'm not giving you the authentic movie experience of being immersed in Titanic for 3 hours.
No, you're giving us the at-home VHS. The VHS tape ended. It's time to go make some dinner before we come back and watch the other half.
Absolutely. So, a couple more facts, and then we'll get into talking about the movie. So, this was the first. So the release of this film is kind of interesting. So, in its theatrical run, which was over the course of 10 months, um, from December of 1997 to October of 98, that is unheard of for today. Today, the average movie is in theater for 4 weeks because there is a distinct drop off in people going to the theater after 2 weeks. Um, Very rarely nowadays do movies get re-released in theaters. This one was re-released several years later to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking. And during that release, it made an additional $400 million that pushed the total profit or the total gross of the film to $2.2 billion, which is easily at that time the most any movie has ever made. Um,
Yeah, I definitely contributed to that when I went and saw it in 2012. And it was also in 3D. So those tickets were 3D ticket prices. So we're talking like $25, maybe between 15 and 25. So, maybe that wasn't as many people going to see it as the numbers suggest.
well, it would be interesting for us to see how much the price of movie tickets has changed over the years because it's certainly a lot now.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's something that you'll probably get sick of me complaining about pretty quickly.
yeah, that's fair. I'll put something in post that says how much a movie ticket is now. Hello, this is Garrett in post production. So, accounting for inflation, a ticket to see Titanic in today's money is about $7. The average ticket price in America is about $10.50. If you're a child, the elderly, or a U.S. service member, you can have your price affected. If you go see a matinee, it's a bit cheaper. If you want to go see a 3D film, it's going to be $2 or $3 more than the average ticket price.
Cool. Yeah,
Uh, yeah, go
no,
for
go
it.
on,
Sorry.
go on.
Okay. So I was going to get more into the making of stuff. So James Cameron is a notoriously he's the director and writer of this film. He's a notoriously difficult person to work with. This film gave him the moniker of the scariest man in Hollywood. Um, and his previous film, The Abyss, which was released a few years earlier, they also filmed in water, but in deeper dive tanks that required camera crews to be in the water submerged for over 5 hours and spend an hour or two decompressing on the way up. It also pushed many actors to the breaking point. Ed Harris at one point remarked about driving home one day and just breaking down in tears on the side of the road from the stress that it was caused. Um, this film had many sicknesses because they decided to film so many of the scenes in this giant tank that the uh, model of the Titanic was filmed in. It led to people getting the flu, the common cold, and even Kate Winslet developing some kidney problems as a result of being submerged in water for so long. Um, and this is very funny. So there was a disgruntled employee that worked somewhere on this shoot, and during filming in Canada, before they transitioned to filming in Mexico, they had spiked a soup that many of the people who were in the production were sharing. They spiked it with PCP, which is a wonderful hallucinogen, and that ended up putting 50 people in the hospital. And this person was never caught. So,
Wow. I did not know that.
no, very interesting. So that's a lot of the behind the scenes. There's a lot more to go on to it, including the footage that we see of the Titanic wreck is real. It was gotten over the course of a year. I think they did 12 missions where they went down and filmed the Titanic with submarines, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. And they ended up damaging parts of the Titanic while they were doing that. So, that's I don't think that's good. But those shots at the beginning of the movie where we see submarines uh, investigating the Titanic are amazing and incredibly immersive to show you what's really down there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that they were able to, get together the lighting and the film equipment to be able to go down there and do that in the 90s. Because that's a lot. And, if this was done today, there's no question that they would have just plugged that into a computer and not filmed that at all.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a little bit of talk in what I was reading about them. The studio wanted James Cameron to do that, but he had already financed himself to go down there a couple of times. And he said that for, the same amount of cost or plus a little bit extra, you'd be able to get a much more authentic and realistic, look and vibe to it, um, to the sunken ship. So that's what ended up happening. He got his way in many regards. James Cameron ended up taking a pretty big pay cut and losing out on a lot of the profits just so he could have his vision shared. He also said if they wanted somebody else to edit it, they'd have to fire him to remove that hour of footage. And if they wanted to fire him, they would have had to have killed him.
Yeah, he had some strong opinions about this one, and it's good because had they have taken an hour out of this movie, where on earth they would have taken it, and it would have ruined it, and we would not be sitting here talking about it. The actors and actresses would not have gone on to be who they are, and the, and Cameron probably wouldn't have gone on to do, great things again. So I'm glad that he stuck to it and really, made this happen. Um, I think that, the best thing about Titanic and Cameron doing this is that this is a movie made by real nerds who really love the Titanic and who are obsessed with it. There are so many details that he went into, just minute details that could have been totally lost, or and we wouldn't even have noticed if they weren't there, like stamping the plates with the white star line logos, or the silverware, or even just like paying attention to the actual accounts of actual people who were on the Titanic and what they went through. Like, he went through the history, he was obsessed with this, and he caused a lot of people to be obsessed with Titanic after this.
Absolutely. Going so far as to recreate, to rebuild, to make a model of a lot of the Titanic is impressive in its own right. To pour over photos, to have the records and the diagrams and plans opened up to you to be able to faithfully recreate the rooms and locations, the grand staircase. They got artisans in to craft the hand railings and the fine clocks in that room. To do all that and to then still go ahead and destroy this, expensive thing that you built is quite an achievement.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the artist's vision and the ephemeral nature of art versus the permanent nature of film. I mean, any film can be lost or destroyed for sure, but that where would we put if I'm an artist and I want to recreate some part of Titanic, like say it's the staircase with the clock, I want to recreate that. Okay, now what? I did it. Where do I put that? I don't know. Nobody wants that. For real, like lots of people want that, but then when it really comes down to it, what do you actually do with that? And to have it in a movie where it gets destroyed and thrown out with all the rest of the props in the end, but it has a permanency being in this film that really warms my heart as an artist, that that this is a real work of love and attention and detail and mania. I mean, he was a maniac about this. We can't, sidestep this, that, he fits the artist trope of being a maniac about all the fine details and little things that just need to be right. And for this movie, it's worth it. It's worth every little thing.
Yeah, I can't really understate how immersive and an experience this is. And I know I've used that word a lot in the past, but one of the things that I think makes this so immersive is there's very few, at least that I can tell, like things that stray too far from reality. In disaster movies, especially, we have a lot of things that can pull you out of reality. People flying the plane faster than the explosion or outrunning an earthquake with a car. But in this, the disaster feels grounded. All of the characters, all of the action, it feels real. It feels tactile. All of the locations, again, they look like what you would expect them to look like. And I think in the opening shots of the movie, having the submarines go throughout the ship and give you that like overview of this is the impending doom that's going to happen. You can start to really like see into the ship and start to see the places that become important, like the grand staircase, like uh, the suite, like the bow of the ship, where all of the action that takes place in the movie happens there. And I feel like starting it with it being destroyed and then seeing it in its glory and heyday just further emphasizes like that level of care and attention they're putting into making it so real.
Yeah, they really do a great job. Like I do not joke when I say that this is my favorite movie. It is my favorite movie. It's been my favorite movie since 1996. It's not changing. There are so many great things about it. I understand why it's like, overrated or like whatever. Like fine. Like there are other great movies out there. I'm not going to say that I only watch Titanic, but whatever. This movie really is great, and the details are really great. And I think I was just like running through the entire movie in my head for implausibility, and there are a few things that happen with Jack and Rose that you're like, I don't, this isn't really like plausible, but it's possible. It's not plausible, like the whole Jack and Rose plot, not plausible, but totally possible, and totally they could have done it. So two thumbs up.
Yeah, so I had never seen this film in its entirety. I know I'd seen clips of it or parts of it, and of course I've seen countless references in our popular culture and allusions to the story and parody and things like that. And I feel like in many ways that sort of stuff lessened the effect that I think it could have had for me as a viewer watching it now. Um, but I absolutely understand what you mean by it being, your favorite, it being something that has so much and it being a huge work of art and love and passion. Um, I don't necessarily see it as my favorite movie or anything like that because I don't have a personal connection to it as so much. But I absolutely understand how that is, and it's very good. It's a very good movie.
Yeah, I think that the other good thing is that it really does have it all. It's a love story, which, as a girl, ooh, love story. But it's also a action adventure disaster movie, which is something that, do I love action adventure disaster movies because of Titanic, or would I have loved them anyway? I'm not sure, but it's certainly a genre that I loved. And it also, from watching it very often at a young age, I developed a, huge interest in the Titanic, in the history, in those personal accounts, the whole Titanic era, fashion and art and like all of that stuff. This is an era of history that, if the Titanic was not something to talk about, there's not much going on in the 1912s. You know, it's an area where there's a lot of opulence, but there's a lot of industry. So you have a lot of like upcoming industrial people like Cal and his family. Um, but it's also a time, right before the First World War is starting to brew, and then you have a lot of immigrants coming to America, and that these giant ocean liners, like, they are how the immigrants got to America, and they were the most expedient way for immigrants to get to America. And that really started that whole process. It didn't start the process, but it escalated in this period. So it's definitely a time in history that I've been fascinated with. I have read tons of books about Titanic. There was one book that I think was actually put out by James Cameron, that it had like a whole bunch of different shipwrecks that he had gone to and taken photos of and scenes, so I know way too much information about lots of shipwrecks. So it's good stuff.
Yes, so where do we begin talking about the movie?
Well, so I think that, there's two separate, so the movie is very easily divided into two parts. As you might know, if you were alive in the 90s, we had VHS tapes, and a 3-hour movie doesn't fit on a VHS tape. And so even though it should, like it really should, but it didn't. So whatever. Um, So this movie was divided very squarely at the moment after the iceberg hits, when they arrest Jack. So you have the love story before the iceberg hits, and then you have the sinking of the Titanic, really right in half. So that's the two different parts of the movie, and then along with that, you also have the backstory of the present day time of the older Rose telling the story to the people on the ship trying to find her necklace.
Yes, so we can start with the framing then. So there is a group of scientists or explorers who are, diving down into the Titanic to look for the heart of the sea, which is this very valuable diamond.
Garrett, Garrett,
What?
Garrett. It is
What?
not the heart of the
It's
sea.
not the
It's
heart
the
of the
heart
sea.
of the ocean.
Heart of the
Heart of the
ocean.
ocean.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. The heart of the ocean. I apologize. Um,
Get it right.
and they end up stealing a safe that they think it might be in, and they find a drawing that's done by Jack of Rose. And at this point in time, the woman who is very old and who was Rose recognizes this as her picture, and then talks to the people on the boat to be able to go there and like share her story. Um, an interesting thing about the sketch of Rose is it was done by James Cameron himself.
Yeah, which is a little weird.
It's a little weird.
I did look it up. I thought that they were younger because they do mention in the show that Rose DeWitt Bukater died when she was 17 on the Titanic. So in the movie she's 17, but the actors were in their 20s, which is a little more comfortable. I guess it does make sense that an unmarried woman would be 17. Fine. I think in today's day and age, and even like the romance novels that I read now, usually they age up that character to be 19. So that's that. And then also the other thing that was interesting is that I found that that was the first scene that they filmed.
Yeah, was Leonardo DiCaprio drawing a nude Kate Winslet, which is uh
Awkward.
yeah, a little awkward. I think James Cameron said that they filmed that scene first because they had the set built, and he wished they would have filmed it later when the actors had a bit more chemistry because it was obvious that they were both kind of nervous and they'd only ever done script reads with each other. They hadn't filmed scenes together yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it works. Like, I like that nervousness, and I think that for these two young people that have never done anything like this before, um, I think that that's, I think it works. But yeah, that it starts off, the filming of the whole thing is a little suspect.
Yeah, yeah, a bit. Um, so we should we should press on with some more of the plot. So once the old lady Rose starts talking and she begins telling the story of what happened on the Titanic. Um, and Leonardo DiCaprio, he's in this. He plays Jack Dawson, who is an American who travels around the world. He went to France to, show off some of his drawings, and he wins a trip on the Titanic back to America over a game of cards.
It's a
And
lucky hand of poker.
yes, well, very lucky or very unlucky.
That's true, yeah. I
Uh,
don't know.
it very much reminds me of like that. Almost sounds like a story of how nowadays during the disasters, many people have their like, oh, I could have, I
Hmm.
missed my flight on September 11th,
Yes.
or Mr. Beast saying he could have been on the submarine that imploded. Very much you could hear a disgruntled person being like, well, I'm glad I lost that hand of poker, or I would have died on the Titanic.
Well, and this is fascinating too, because that's something that came out in, 1,000 news stories in April of 2012 or 2012, 1912, was that all of these people came forward and were like, "Oh, I could have been on that ship." Like I think JP Morgan had tickets but decided to stay longer. The other thing that's interesting here, when we think of like traveling across the Atlantic on this boat, you think of a ticket that you buy months in advance, but that wasn't quite the case for the Titanic. The ship was actually delayed in its production and its sea trials, so it was supposed to take its maiden voyage a few days earlier, but didn't. So, that kind of messed up a lot of people's travel plans as far as like who was planning to be on the boat. A lot of the characters who end up on the boat were involved in, the production and design of the boat. So they, of course, were going to be on it no matter what. But I mean, it's certainly possible that, Rose and her family wouldn't have been on the boat. They would have just taken the next one had something, come up in their personal lives because, they didn't care about, missing the boat or getting the tickets to the next one and whatnot. It just didn't matter to them.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that because the boat was delayed and didn't sail on the day it was supposed to, it wasn't, I think it was only half full, um, or like just over half. So a lot more people could have died if they would have sold all the tickets.
I see. I didn't know this.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, think about it, like if you're, gonna go get tickets to go across the ocean, like, do you really want to go in April?
Yeah,
Maybe you wait till May.
that's one of the things I thought was interesting is we see Jack out on deck a lot in the movie, and I gotta imagine in April on the ocean it's not very warm. Like,
No, no. And I think they show that, later in the movie, that it's cold. I think that it would have been warm in the sun. So I think seeing people
Right.
taking off their jackets and being on the boat deck, I think that would have made sense. The other thing that's interesting, and this would actually make sense for Jack being on the deck, is that the whole time that they were sailing, they were having issues with the forced air heating in the third class, and I think even some of the second class rooms had the forced air, and I think a lot of the the bigger like ballrooms and stuff, the eating rooms, whatever they're called. So the forced air heating was not working right. So it probably would have been fairly cold below decks also. The first class and second class passengers generally had electric heaters in their rooms, so they weren't bothered at all by this.
Hmm. So that brings us into kind of like a discussion about the Titanic as a boat and about in many ways it seemed ill prepared to make this journey.
Yeah, it was a rush job for sure. It had just passed its sea trials. The captain, this was going to be his last a trip. He had very recently crashed a Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, in the fall, I think in October, and she had to be. So Olympic had to be repaired, and that's why Titanic was delayed. That's what happened there. She also almost crashed in the trying to get out of port in Belfast. So that's a fun one. The giantness of the ship caused another boat to be kind of like suctioned toward it, and it almost and it like broke free of a lot of its moorings, but was able to be, tugged back into place so that they didn't, collide. But then they left that part out of the movie, probably as a that was probably like a unnecessary detail. But Titanic had not had a solid, time. There was also, I think, a coal strike happening. Um, in and around Belfast, so loading the Titanic with coal had been a difficult, and there had been, strikes and protests. And then I know that some of the boiler staff missed the boat completely, when so they lived because they messed up their clocks and missed the boat.
And let's not forget the people who were in charge of watching out for icebergs. They did not have uh, binoculars.
Yeah, yeah, the binocular issue, I think that that has been, it might have been debunked, but I mean in the movie they play it up. There should have been binoculars for the crow's nest. Um, it's a this is a, a test flight almost. And that's one of the reasons why this like scramble to try and go as fast as possible on the maiden voyage is kind of crazy. So what they were trying to do is there's an award that you can get called the Blue Riband, and you get it for being the fastest across, forward or east and then west. You can get it for one or the other or both. And the Titanic was going to try and get it, and that was why they were speeding along when they got to the ice field. And maybe they should have gone slower, maybe they should have paid attention to the ice warnings, maybe the ice warnings should have been more detailed in their like, no, really, it's really bad. You should just slow to a crawl. Um, but there's a lot of hubris in the unsinkability of the ship design too, which in theory would have been great. And a lot of ships, to this day have a similar design, but no ship is unsinkable.
No, anything we make can, if it can be put together, it can be taken apart.
Hmm.
Um, so let's go on to our next slide. Now that we've set up kind of like, what the Titanic is and the adventure we're going to go on. Let's start with VHS tape one, in the machine and talk about Jack and Rose.
Yeah, so this is the romance, the love story, and I think that you can't talk about Titanic without talking about the love story. And something that I have been thinking about often is what even is romance, in life and stories. And I actually saw a great video recently. One of my friends sent it to me, because we were discussing aromanticism and like the lack of being able to understand, or lack of having romantic feelings and those kinds of things. And the entire idea of romance and uh, romantic stuff comes from medieval poems about love. Like before that, there were plenty of stories about love, but the idea of a romance as a genre comes in this time, and it's romance is just a very fantasy story. It's full of impossible feats of being saved by the good guy from a dragon, and just really unlikely scenarios, but also like weird tension, like falling in love with your husband's servant, or like best man, like in Lancelot and Guinevere of Camelot, that kind of a scenario. So these are all stories meant to evoke feelings, but they're not really based in reality. And I mean, this is something that's that comes through in Titanic, is that you see this romance coming together, but what is it really based in? And it is a fantasy. This thing that happens between this well brought up girl and this poor guy in this very Romeo and Juliet kind of a situation, which is how Cameron described it at one point, which I have a lot of issues with. But there are elements there.
Yeah, it's not it's not really Romeo and Juliet.
No. But you have
Um,
the family elements of like, the family being like, no. And then you also have, I think that the real connection is there is that, Jack and Rose both make really bizarre decisions over the course of the movie that are dumb and put them in jeopardy often. Like ultimately they're trying to save each other throughout the entirety, but a lot of them, like, ew, like that, don't go down that hallway, don't go down that stairwell, like go up the stairs, those kinds of, decisions that, um, they create that kind of like, that, like they're it's a fantasy scenario that's totally unlikely, but in that moment we're seduced by their romance and believe it, and so we suspend the belief that all this is just insane. I mean, they meet each other and 3 days later they're willing to die for each other. That's some serious love right there.
Hello, this is Garrett in post-production. If the following topics of self-harm or suicide are upsetting to you, we would recommend you turn away. They are a large plot point in the movie that we will be discussing. Thank you. Yes, it's very serious, but we if we explain the framing of their love, or if they're meeting a bit better, then I think that would start to make a little bit more sense. So Kate Winslet's character Rose is set to marry this older gentleman who has new money. He's an industrialist, and her family has none. And her mother's really pressuring her into this marriage and this lifestyle. And she hates it. She doesn't want to do it. So she decides she's just going to end it all and jump into the Atlantic Ocean. Um, and it is in that scene where uh, Jack, he sees her going to do this and he talks her off of that ledge.
Yeah, her wanting to commit suicide is, it's something that I think that you forget about in as you go through the movie. You forget that, this girl is in such a bad place in her life and so frustrated and so afraid at the prospect of her future that she's willing to just jump off this ship and die. So looking at their relationship as, A, he saves her and stops her from committing suicide, but then B, all of her decisions after that are like, well, I was just going to die anyway, so I'm going to make these decisions with that, in mind.
Yeah, it starts to make a little bit more sense why she, tries to keep going after Jack makes a speech at dinner about, making every moment count. And I felt like that really resonates with her. Um, but yeah, she just goes off the deep end the whole time. And then at the end, she has the will to live. She decides not to die. She decides that she's gonna, fight to get back on the lifeboat and live, and then still given the chance to get back with this guy and have a, reasonably, wealthy and luxurious life, she still says, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah,
So
and I think that speaks to the, her mindset of like how terrible that life was going to be and how she felt that, if she gets on that lifeboat and if Cal knows that she's on that lifeboat, then there's no way for her to escape. Um, so her, jumping back on Titanic and dying alone with Jack is like her method of, it is it another suicide attempt? I don't want to say that, but in a similar vein, that's kind of the idea is that she makes these decisions based on her, you know, not necessarily needing to live. So that's an interesting, it's just an interesting dynamic that we do not see in other movies.
no, you really don't.
Yeah, suicide is such a like a taboo topic in a lot of things, and I mean, I'm sorry if we didn't put a trigger warning in there. If you've even if you've seen Titanic, you might have forgot that this was such a huge plot point because it is the catalyst for, everything that happens after. Um,
Yeah, I did not know this was the inciting incident.
mhm.
And I feel like there are many other scenes in this film that I know of existing, whether they've been parodied or I've seen clips of them. But this being the inciting connection and the thing that starts to break, both of their worlds into like being exposed to, what's out there is, well, it's rather bleak because after Jack talks Rose off the ledge, she screams because she nearly does fall and die, and she doesn't want to at that point. And uh, people come to investigate, and they believe that Jack is assaulting her,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he can't really talk himself out of that situation and has to rely on her having the same compassion towards him that he had towards her.
Right, and there was significant hesitation in her, which is, I never understood that. Watching it, as a kid is how why would she not just tell them what happened? I mean, but the stigma against suicide, I guess, is so huge. But also, like, I think it took her a long time to figure out a plausible explanation. Lovejoy points out that he had time to take off his jacket and his shoes. Which, why didn't Jack just say, "Oh, I took them off before then. I was sitting up here on the boat deck or some shit." I don't know. That was something that always bothered me. And it's had she not said something, gosh, like I think that would have ruined all our compassion for her.
Absolutely. The fact that she was willing to risk, like, she was willing to embarrass herself by saying, "Oh yeah, I was just being silly and almost fell off the boat." Like, having that, I think starts her down that track of being totally okay to embarrass herself, because we see her do that later on in an attempt to not only just fit in with Jack, but to explore new experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean the other thing is that we almost have to thank, societal norms for having that one, the rich fat old guy believing her. Because if I was Cal, I wouldn't have believed her, you know. And Lovejoy could have said something then, have been like, pointed it out, or um there are a lot of scenarios, but I think that the idea that, oh, someone would put their hands on my woman, like, oh, and any explanation is better than that, it is what saved her and made them believe her. Such an interesting little bit of dialogue there.
Yeah, that's one of the scenes that I think really pushes the limits of believability. But if you frame it in, closer to what the 1900s and how women were treated and how, suicide again wasn't a norm or something that's talked about, things like that. And, it changes. And especially Rose being of a higher class, she has more inherent believability. Um,
Yeah, yeah, she definitely has more inherent believability, and I think that it's easy for, men at this time period to be like, oh, just silly woman, you know. And the assumption that if she's willing to say what she says publicly, then any questions would be taken care of behind closed doors.
mhm. And so one thing about this scene that I think is interesting, because we have several scenes that take place at this spot on the boat,
Hmm.
or at the front end of the boat. So this takes place on the back end. So earlier in the film, we have the "I'm King of the World" scene, and that's at the front, where Jack and his friend are hanging off the railings, and just like, they're watching the dolphins, they're seeing the world, they're excited for the adventure, they're the kings of their reality. And then later at night, we see Rose, who is, down on her luck and willing to die, the back of the boat, hanging onto the railing, very similar parallels, and, completely opposite tones, completely opposite motivations for what they're doing. And then further on in the film, as Jack and Rose's relationship further develops, Jack takes her back to the front of the ship and does, the very similar King of the World scene, and they kiss, and they, show their freedom to each other, and that's really where Rose breaks out of that like depressive spiral and the being a part of the upper and wealthy class, and decides she wants to be with somebody who's fun and happy and lively.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, if we're going back and forth in the time frame of the romance, I do want to talk about the dinner scene at one point, but
Oh yeah.
the on the subject of the suicide attempt, the moment where Rose and Jack have that conversation in the room after church on the Sunday, where he tells her, if you don't, you're going to die if you don't break free. There's a flame in you that's going to go out, and it's going to take a while because you're strong, but if you don't move, um, you're going to they're going to ruin you. That speech is such a great speech for, I think that his, like, getting her out of having a suicide attempt was, decent, like, good job. But that speech right there, I think that's such a powerful moment, and a an excellent time to discuss Jack as a, savior of Rose. In addition to the suicide attempt, like, yes, he saves her then, like, physically, he gets her off away from the boat, or away from the edge of the boat. Fine. But that speech that he gives her there, I think, is even more empowering.
Yes, that's definitely what saves her life. Um, because we see through the old lady Rose, we see like photos of her later in life, and she's like, posed with an airplane. They say she's an actress. Like she goes on to have a lot more agency, and this is the inciting speech that gets her there.
Yeah, where she breaks away from her family and truly decides that, the life that they have planned for her is not what she is going to do. And her plan going forward, regardless of the Titanic sinking, is not a great plan. But her motivations for it and her ideas about it are really solid. Because I mean, in theory, like if the boat didn't sink, then she would have had to get off the ship with these people, and she would have had to figure out a way to escape them before she got married. And the Pinkertons, who the Lovejoys and ex Pinkerton, so they would have just tracked her down and drug her back to the Isle, and made her mom miserable. So the Titanic sinking and her gaining that anonymity is really the best thing to happen for her.
Right? She wouldn't have been able to have the life that she did if things went according to plan.
Right. I mean, even in 1912, as a rich person, it wasn't exactly easy to disappear. A rich woman.
Right, and especially if she went ahead with, stealing from her husband, tracking down wherever they could have sold the diamond, or, where the money went, wouldn't have been too hard, I don't think. But um, yeah, because we later learn that she's held on to the diamond all these years, and it part of it is definitely, well, if she would have sold it at any point, that would have given her away. Um, but that could have been a great thing to start her life with. Um,
Yeah, but she was able to have her own agency and do all those things without the help of the diamond, without, the help of her family. And I mean, in that way, it's a very pro-feminist, powerful, moving story of agency in a world where, women weren't, given much. And I think it's worth it pointing out too that, when all these people came back from the Titanic on the Carpathia, they the press and all of that was insane. This was the biggest thing to happen in a very long time, maybe since the Great Molasses Flood. Like it was huge. And the fact that it happened to rich people made it even bigger. So there was a lot of welfare available to the people who were on the Titanic, and they were able to use their fame to make money, even the poorer people. So again, the Titanic sinking was the best thing to happen to her.
yeah, that's a very unfortunate thing to say, but it is
But
for
it
her
it
story.
is,
Yeah,
yeah. And I mean, she is an imaginary person. She didn't really exist. But if she did, like, this is looking at the glass half full situation here. Very
right.
positive. I
So
think that's one of the reasons why this movie is so compelling for me, um, and one of the reasons why I like it so much, and the story and the character of Rose is she has to go through this really huge change, to be able to gain her own agency, in a coming of age story, really. Like that's a really, and there aren't that many female coming of age stories that work, and that aren't a Disney princess situation. And in that way, yeah, it's really
right,
good.
right. As this being framed as a riches to rags, like honestly, and that being good is a very different type of story that I can't say I have much, familiarity with. But
Yeah.
so would you like to mention your theory?
Yeah. So
Okay.
in this, when I was watching it this week, I was trying to put on a different eye of, I've seen this movie literally thousands of times. Like it is insane how many times I've seen this movie. Like I can quote the whole thing, and I've been doing so pretty well. Um, but I was trying to think of like new things about it and to try to like delve into it. And I came across this like this thought popped into my head that Jack is actually a manic pixie dream boy in that, he, and this is an archetype in film where you have this manic, and it's usually a woman. So it's this manic pixie dream girl. Um, it's a stock character type, and a film critic, Nathan Rabin, said that it's a character that exists only to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures.
Yes, and when you explained this theory to me earlier, I was like 100% because that's a character that I remember seeing in movies and other media when I was growing up. Of there's a relationship, there's a woman that's eccentric and opens up the guy to having more having more agency, having more say in their life, and wanting to do more adventures and things. And that's exactly what Leonardo DiCaprio does in this one.
Yeah. I mean, he's that like guy who says, "Oh, no, you've never ridden horseback. You've only rode side saddle. You've never been on a roller coaster. Hell, you've never even spit before. I'll teach you how to spit right now." So he pushes her, just not even just out of the suicide range and out of like being stuck in that, porcelain box, but into like a whole other world when he like takes her dancing and shows her that these people, the third class people are real. Like they're humans, they're fun. They drink, they laugh, they cry, they
They have
dance.
their own arts, their own entertainment. They have much different views of like, masculinity and time, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
and he pushes her to change.
yeah, so I guess we should talk about those scenes now, the dinners that they have.
Yeah.
So Leonardo DiCaprio gets invited to dinner to kind of like tell the story of how he saved Rose, and they don't really do that, but they do that as a way of thanking him. And we're introduced more heavily to another one of the characters that's based off a real person, the unsinkable Molly Brown, who is a the wife of a gold miner in California who's a part of this new wealth, and she doesn't really fit in with everyone else, but she uses that as a way to help Leonardo DiCaprio fit into this upper class by lending him a tuxedo that she's bought for her son, who's the same size or age as Leonardo DiCaprio. And I really like their interaction, their relationship that they have, because they're both these people who are trying to fit in with a group of people that does not want them to be a part of it, and they both have to almost play off of each other to be able to do so.
Yeah, they're both outsiders. They're both kind of like disliked by this group because they don't like new money. They don't, care for this. And I think that while the idea of joining them for dinner in first class was, supposed to be something to thank him, I think ultimately it was a way to humiliate him because they
Oh,
would have expected
absolutely.
him. Yeah, they would have expected him to show up in his rags and to talk about, like talk with a thick accent or like, whatever. So I think that Jack, and Molly together, proving them wrong, and I love that Molly, I think that she knows that everyone hates her, and refuses to accept it and
Yes.
is, bent on, showing these people up. I think that she knows she's never going to be accepted, so she, pushes the buttons and she doesn't like them. So, why bother, putting on a show of liking them and not, trying to push the buttons. So,
Yeah,
The dinner scene, I really like that scene.
and I really think she does a good job of paralleling who Rose could be if she had her own agency and perhaps if she had her own choice at picking who she wanted to marry instead of, being assigned to somebody. It shows someone who's still of that upper class, but is, out there and different.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really good point I hadn't thought about as Molly as a role model for Rose. I think that's a good point that when she's looking around and seeing all these, annoying rich people, at least, there's somebody who is trying to push the bounds. And, we see Molly later on in the movie doing so many things to, you know, eh, stop the classism and that kind of stuff that's going on.
yes. So shortly after this dinner, um, the men and women adjourn, and then Rose and Jack sneak off to the lower classes dining and accommodations and have a grand old time down there.
Yeah, whenever I hear these songs, I hear them occasionally at like Renaissance fairs and stuff like that. I will think about Titanic.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting, these two scenes are very interesting because they give us that comparison of the upper and lower classes. And we can, move past these are just two different sections on a boat to these are commentaries and critiques on society at the time. And one thing I think is really interesting is uh, Rose's husband at one point is like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna adjourn to, have brandy and cigars. You don't want to stick around here and listen to the women gossip." But when they go on their adventure, all they're doing is gossiping. And I feel like there's a lot to be said about masculinity between these two scenes because we have the upper class, they're just going to drink and, smoke and they say talk business, but that's not what they're doing. But when we go to the lower class, we see a lot more traditional forms of masculinity, of like people having arm wrestling contests, drinking lots of beer, and like getting into fights with one another. And I just when I was watching that, I just thought, oh yeah, this is a very excellent parallel to like start to show the femininity of these upper class guys who are like demasculated in many ways, and Jack kind of goes out of his way to emasculate Rose's fiance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and the amount of fun that is had in the lower decks is, poignant too. I mean, it's everybody is dancing and laughing and having a good time, even if their, possessions are meager and their funds are meager and maybe the food's not as good and but the beer apparently is flowing either way. So yeah, I think that showing Rose that the world the the world of poverty might be difficult, but it is these people are happy. No one upstairs is happy. Everyone is so staid and socially anxious about everything. But these people downstairs who might not know, how they're going to eat in 4 days when they get off this boat, they're happy.
Yeah, when every day the rich people have, the fine meals, the good drinks, they're able to, take all their possessions on a cruise and, travel luxuriously. When the people downstairs have like just like this grand old time of getting together with people they've never met before and accepting one another and dancing around and just being free, that's such a distinction because the people in the upper class, if you're new money, if you're there alone, if you're not there with, the right people, or even if you're not the right type of person, you're not a part of those circles. Whereas, the lower class loves and engages in the, camaraderie between people and between cultures. It's so different, and opens up Rose's worldview to, I think, further support her, desire to break free and to see that, like, oh, all of these lies she's probably been told about the poor have been wrong.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And while this whole scene might not be historically accurate at all, it is unlikely that especially the different, ethnic groups in the Titanic would have all been, partying together, and having as happy a time as is in this scene. Still does create that great dynamic and contrast between the two dinners.
Yeah, I really thought that was an excellent part of the movie. Uh, and then after the dinners, is that when they get chased through the ship?
No, after the
No.
dinner, it fades away, and then we have the "I'm your fiance" fight between Cal and Rose.
Right.
Yeah, and that is, you know, that I think is such an important, scene for her to see him for who he really is. Maybe up until this point she just thought he was a dick. Now, when he like flips the table, he's a violent dick. And I think that while she ultimately is, terrified into like um obedience for the next few hours, um she does, that's one of the things that, really solidifies into her mind that she cannot go through with marrying him.
Yes. I would say that's really the tipping point.
Yeah. Yeah, so for the rest of that day, in the morning, uh, Rose goes to a church. All go to church, and Jack tries to break in and is denied entry and told off. And then she has tea with her mother, where she very much sees you know, or I guess they tour the ship next. So they go on a tour of the ship, and this is one of the great like moments of foreshadowing in the whole thing. Is they take a tour of the ship and they find out about the lifeboats and how many people are on board, and they overhear one of the ice warnings and meet the captain, and it's such a like, we're getting closer kind of a situation.
Yeah, and Rose is able to put together that there aren't enough lifeboats for all the people on board, and that's going to be really bad if something happens.
Yeah,
Um,
she is definitely concerned about that, and that shows, her humanity and her um interest in it, as opposed to her mother, who is very much like, ugh, well, the first class people need lifeboats. Ugh. And Cal doesn't believe that the ship could sink, which is just folly.
yeah, well, many people believe that. It was said to be unsinkable, so take that as you will. If it can be built, it can be destroyed. Um,
It's made of steel and iron, sir. I assure you, she can sink.
Very heavy.
Yeah. Sorry, more quotes. Sorry. If you haven't seen Titanic as many times as me, you're not going to get all the quotes that I've been dropping, and I'm sorry. I think you need to go watch it about a dozen more times.
Has. Um, yeah, and during the tea scene, I have a note. So, Rose is talking to her mom, and that doesn't really work. And then she sees also in that dining hall another like little girl being commanded by their mother, and to like sit up, stay straight, be proper, and the little girl can't be more than like 4 or 5. And I think she sees in that not only how she was controlled the whole time, but how she's going to continue to be controlled.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she sees that, and she sees the pattern, and she sees the contrast between that girl and the girl in the third class that Jack danced with, Cora. And I think, and that scene was so, like, it was so moving for me, as a young girl watching this and seeing that, like, the little girls are meant to be seen and not heard mentality that the high class, first class women were supposed to be doing. And very much in, Rose is sitting there listening to her mother talk about her wedding as if she's not there, as if she's not part of the plan. She is very much just there as a showpiece. And yeah, that's I think one of the, like, several things that fully makes her change her mind and decides that she is not going to go on with this existence.
Mhm. So it's at that point that Rose goes back to try to find Jack, right?
Yeah, yeah. So she goes to um the bow of the ship, and they have the "I'm flying" love scene, which is very nice. It's very romantic and lovely. And the sun sets for the last time on Titanic.
Yes, and then we get to the night of the disaster.
Woo!
Uh,
Yeah, so I guess we already kind of talked about the drawing, and then there's the chase. Did we want to go through that some more?
so I have one thing I'd like to add about the drawing. So it's established that Leonardo DiCaprio is a good artist and that he's drawn many people. And Rose wants herself to be drawn. She sees that commission. She commissions him to draw. And I thought this was interesting because throughout the whole rest of the movie, Rose is treated as an object to Cal and her mother, of being like this person to use to maintain their station in society and to give her fiance a name and like more history and meaning to whatever he's got going on. But then um, Rose decides in her own agency to, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this incorrectly, but almost to objectify herself by immortalizing herself in this nude, exposed expression of her freedom, which is seen later by her fiance as like a betrayal and an expression of like distaste and something that isn't proper anymore.
Yeah, I really appreciate that idea, Garrett. The idea of her harnessing her sexuality for her own self and for her own agency and for her own interests. I think that it was incredibly silly of her to put the picture in the safe where she knew he would see it before they, disembarked the ship. I think that was dumb. Um, and that she should have waited, um, maybe mailed it to his house in the future of some kind. But yeah, yeah, doing that is incredibly empowering, and it is such a, ballsy, for lack of a better term, move for her to do that.
Yeah, at first I thought because in many ways nudity can be seen as really just objectifying women. And I think in some films and media, it really is. It's seen of, taking away who they are and then just having them be sex symbols. But in this, it was really her desiring that on her own volition. And I feel like that was communicated very well.
Yeah, it's a really, that's a really great idea, and I love the line, like, the last thing I need is another thing that looks, or another picture of me looking like a porcelain doll. And I mean, in this, it's a different kind of porcelain doll, but yeah, it's a great, Great pro-feminist move there.
Yes, so then after this, Lovejoy, he's hunting down Rose because she's somewhere, and he stumbles upon that they were in here and chases them throughout the ship. And we get a couple good scenes of exploring the other decks of the ship, which I think greatly prepares us for the disaster to come. So earlier on in the movie, we had a couple great scenes establishing areas of the ship. We, of course, had, exploring the first class with Rose, exploring the third class bunks with Jack. We had a scene in the captain's quarters where they are relaying information down to the engineering room, and we see further down into the bowels of the ship with the boilers. But in this chase scene, we're again reminded of, the first class, it all connects. You go downstairs, you travel throughout, go down the elevators in the grand staircase, get to the lower classes. You can sneak down into the boiler room, run through the coal, and end up in the cargo hold with the car that we saw at the beginning of the movie. Um, I've seen the car in parodies before, so seeing it before and here and then later on when the ship gets destroyed is a nice parallel, a nice bit of foreshadowing of this movie has a lot of objects that are important, especially in the early scenes where we see the wreckage. We hold on several shots of the grand staircase. We see that tons and tons of times throughout the movie, even at the end. That's the key location, having the staircase be something that's like a pathway to many different events throughout Rose's life.
Yeah, I like the idea of them using that chase scene as a visual mapping of the ship because they very literally go near those areas again um, in the later stages of the sinking.
Yes.
Yeah,
Because one thing I think the sinking does so well is to show us that this wasn't just a problem for uh, the lower class or the crew or the upper class or disaster transcends your station and position in society, and by having us explore the ship one last time and to give us that like openness and glory and splendor of what it looks like before destroying it all is an excellent way to prepare us.
yeah, yeah, that's really good. And the romantic scene in the car is very nice. It's tasteful, as they go. And for a 3-day long romance that these two have been on, it's a nice little bookend to that story.
Absolutely. So after they share a moment in the car, they head off. They're chased out of there by some of the ship crew that are searching for them, and they go up to the main deck where they witness the iceberg. This is
Dun dun dun.
and this is where we start the big second half of the movie. Um, we get back to the sinking of the ship. And at first, it doesn't seem like anything's really gone too horribly wrong. Um, on the upper deck, in some of the first class rooms, they ask, "Oh, what's gone on? The engines have turned off." And one of the crew says, "Ah, we might have thrown a propeller. It's no big problem." Whereas people on the front deck are very aware that we've hit an iceberg. So to kind of explain why this is very, very bad, we have to understand that icebergs are big floating rocks, and uh, it's able to cut through the hull in enough places to start to overfill the watertight compartments. So ships work by having empty space on the inside of them that displaces the weight from above. However, if that weight that is displaced is displaced with water, it no longer has the buoyancy that allows it to stay afloat. So I think on the Titanic, up to four of the hull sections could have been opened, and even if they were totally full of water, the ship would still be able to stay afloat. However, five were opened, and it became mathematically impossible for the ship to continue.
Yeah, five was the lucky number there. I also we didn't talk about it earlier, but this is just fine time to talk about it. In the very beginning of the movie in the modern timeline, there is a computer simulation which shows the sinking.
Right.
Um, and it's shown to to older Rose as like an explanation, of what happened, like blah blah blah. And I think that little computer model was an amazing detail to give us that, like, this is what's going to happen. And this is to like understand how it all worked, like with the physics and all of that. And I think that if we hadn't had that, would have been lost at times from here on out, because as it happens to the people on the ship, nobody knows what's going on. It's so unbelievable. The Titanic sticking out of the air. I mean, that's just crazy that that would happen. But having that computer model really grounded us in, the science of what's actually happening. Even in a lot of the accounts that come after the Titanic, they don't have great explanations of what happened because it was just happened so quickly and it was so unbelievable, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you're in a state of panic, having, and accounting this after the fact would only be harder. Um, so this is where the movie transitions from being a lovely romance into an action adventure movie. Um, so while on deck, Rose and Jack get captured by the Pinkerton Lovejoy and brought back to the first class suite. And Lovejoy plants the heart of the ocean in Jack's coat. So when he gets searched, he's like exposed as being like a thief who's only after Rose and these people and being involved for money. Um,
Yeah, which was a solid plan on their part. I mean, if you're thinking about their motivations, like in the end, like Cal saw that picture. He knows that this guy has seen his fiance, who's he's never slept with, and to his knowledge is a virgin. He's seen her naked, and that's upsetting. So reason number one, not to put the thing in the safe. But I think that regardless of Cal knowing that the Titanic was going to sink, because I don't think he knew that at this point, but of imprisoning Jack. I mean, this is a decent plan from a maybe not good, like, Cal is not the most like well thought through villain in movies. He definitely shoots from the hip and acts emotionally at times where it maybe doesn't suit him or help him.
Right, but this is kind of like the culmination in all of these little things that Rose has done to upset him and her mother. And now that he's just like he understands that, he's been cucked now, that he's taking his rage and anger out in the upper class way of throwing the poor people in jail. Like, if this was in the lower class of the Titanic and a similar story happened, I'm sure the two guys would have just gotten into a fist fight. But Cal is above that right now, and
Yeah.
uses this as an opportunity to like permanently separate them and once again get control of Rose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that, at this point he still thinks that Jack's the problem and not, Rose's dissatisfaction with her life. Of course, Cal or her mother are never going to understand that. So, and that's significant. But at the same time, this guy also let her buy all these paintings, and throughout the rest of the movie, he does do a lot of things that end up harming him, you know, in an effort to get Rose, back under his control. So I don't want to say that I don't think that I think Cal, what I'm saying is I think Cal does care about her, whether that's just as an object or, some kind of like, she's, under my custody, so I have to, try and save her. Or maybe like he realizes at some point that she wants to be saved. I don't know. Cal's motivations are a little weird, but that's where we are at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to say if he's trying to save her out of like
Obligation?
yeah, out of obligation, or if he actually cares for her, because I assume he at least cares about her some. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
there are many other fine women he could have married and gone after, but he shows her to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there is some, at least, idea that he does care about her, even if it's just as a sex object or as a trophy on the shelf. He does do things to try to help her eventually.
Yes. Um, so in the disaster part of the movie, a lot happens all at once, and it's kind of it was hard for me to keep a timeline going of what happens.
Oh,
Um,
I know the timeline.
okay,
So,
so what would you like to talk about now?
well, so the next thing that happens is something, that's kind of important in the timeline of Titanic and why things got all fucked up. Is they were trying to load the lifeboats at this point, and everybody on the crew knows that the ship's sinking. At this point, you're probably able to see the ship sinking, as the bow starts to sink, and they're getting out all the lifeboats, and no one is around. The entire first class is just kind of standing around on the first class deck. The second and third classes aren't around at all because they haven't figured it out yet. Titanic does not have any kind of alarm system to alert everybody. It all has to be done by hand, where you just have, people going around telling people to put their life jackets on. But there's no sense of urgency. And this is where, they start loading the first lifeboats, and they're loading them half empty, not just because they, don't know how many people can fit in the lifeboat, but because people aren't there to get in the lifeboats. They aren't mustering. They're cold. They're staying inside. They're worried about their things. They think that the Titanic's unsinkable. So, this is a really real moment of problems with the Titanic, because as the lifeboats start going away half full, that's so many fewer people that get saved in the end. And we do have a limited time frame to get the boat to get the lifeboats off. And while the Titanic sinks very slowly for a boat, I mean, there's a few boats that have sunk slower, but not many. Usually these types of boats, when they sink, they go down in 15 to 20 minutes. So, and that was the same for Lusitania, and the Empress of Ireland, I think, was like 40 minutes tops. So really, you don't have a lot of time to do anything and to load these lifeboats. And I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't have so many lifeboats on the Titanic, is that, like, look, if she's really sinking, it's going to happen so fast we can't load all these lifeboats, so it doesn't matter.
Right. It was my understanding that the amount of lifeboats that were needed was more related to the time it could take to ferry passengers to another boat in the event of like the boat stalls out or something. Not necessarily that it's sinking, but it's inoperable.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that
that
was,
was more of the idea of what lifeboats were for.
hmm, yeah. Well, and I mean, and this is, like historically with boat sinking and lifeboats up until, we had the time of telegraph, you abandon your boat and you get in your lifeboat, and then what do? You sit there and you hope somebody comes by. And because this is a big shipping lane, it's possible somebody comes by. And now that they have telegraphs and stuff, they can alert other vessels so that they can come and get everybody. But yeah, lifeboats as the saving method that we think of them now, not really a thing back then.
No.
You were lucky if you could get in the lifeboat, and then once you got in the lifeboat, you were just out to sea.
Right. And we've totally changed how we, have lifeboats and how those are sent off and built. And now they're almost like, now they're like fully contained things. They're completely inflatable. It's a whole different ballgame now.
Yeah, yeah, there have been some safety improvements since this disaster.
You would hope after 100 years.
Yeah, yeah, and just a few. But even immediately after, like the Britannica, which was the third White Star Line ship, she was fully fitted with enough lifeboats to fit everybody aboard. And in that one, when it sunk, it hit a landmine, or not a landmine, a water mine. Um, it was actually able to save everybody because, except for there were two lifeboats that launched before the boat stopped moving, so they got eaten by the propeller blades, which is just a
Ooh.
great, moment. And actually, fun fact, one of the girls who was on a nurse who was in that lifeboat that she almost died. She didn't die though, but she was in the lifeboat that got hit by the propeller blades. She was actually a maid on Titanic, and she survived both.
Okay. Okay. I know it's statistical unlikely, but if you if you get into one of these disasters, if your boat sinks, your airship crashes, and you survive, that is a sign to never get on one of those again.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And there was actually another guy who was on Titanic who had been on a ocean liner that had sunk also at some point, and he passed away in this one. But yeah, yeah, boats.
Yeah, I mean, it is these disasters and these films that dramatize them and also tell the true story do a lot to scare people. Let's not forget that after Jaws was released, people were afraid to go in the water, despite the fact that you're more likely to get killed by a cow than a great white shark. Or,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I mean the interesting thing here with Titanic is that, honestly, boat sinking is just as likely now as it was then. I mean, you're a little less likely to die at this point, but your cruise ship could easily run into another cruise ship. That happened like 2 weeks ago. Two cruise ships ran into each other, just the giant ones.
oh wow, okay. I
Yeah,
didn't
it
I didn't
was,
hear about this.
yeah, minor damage, but I mean, like, it was still enough for me to go, holy crap, those two boats that were barely moving crushed each other.
Wow. You think with how much space there is in the ocean that this would be a rare occurrence.
That's the thing. Most boats crash in port.
Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. We
Yes.
mentioned earlier the Titanic almost causing another ship to crash.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
it's like, you're most likely to get into a car accident 5 minutes away from your house, because that's
yeah.
where you're driving more and interacting with
Yeah.
more cars. But
Yeah.
back to the
In the parking
Titanic.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, back to the Titanic. At this point, they're trying to load the lifeboats. Rose and Molly and her mom are getting in. Cal's like, "Oh, is there any room for a gentleman, gentleman?" And they're like, "No, it's women and children only at this point." An interesting fun fact about the Titanic is that the women and children only was only a suggestion by the captain. He was like, "Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea." Um, so it was more of a preference for women and children. But one of the officers, Light Tower, who's loading the boats, took that as an order. So he was not letting any men aboard, whereas the other guy was like, whatever, I need to fill these lifeboats with anybody that's around. So that's a little interesting detail. But this is the moment in the movie, or go on.
Yeah, yeah, they touch on that in the movie where Lovejoy says, "Oh, there's a man that's, loading men into boats on the other side of the ship." So,
Yeah. So this is the moment where Rose like figures out that Jack didn't do this. I mean, she knew, but she really believes it, and she also realizes everybody's going to die, and she has fallen in love with Jack. The first half of the movie, if not a love story, it was definitely the story of someone falling in love, and she realizes this, and she, leaves to go and try and find Jack and save him because she knows that he's going to drown if he is in the bottom of the ship wherever, he's been arrested.
so her going on her little journey to find Jack is one of my favorite parts of the film. Um, it reminds me so much of The Shining, where she's going down all these empty corridors and empty hallways, and everybody who she interacts with is just crazy. And she's often doing this by herself, and you get the sense that she not only just feels lost, but she's enclosed and trapped and scared. And then later, when she finds an axe to help rescue Jack, it really ties that connection together a little bit more for me.
Wow, that's such an interesting connection, and Cameron being the movie guy that he was, I'm sure that he, thought about that too as a interesting, because I mean this is also where we start the horror movie, you
Yes.
know like we are, I remember those scenes, and I enjoy them too. They are not my favorite in the movie, but the tension and the fear of her like having to get in that water and cling to the ceiling to move through it with that axe. I mean, these are really, this is where the action adventure and the horror movie comes in.
Yeah. And there's a shot where she's down there and then it switches to a point of view where we're seeing everything as she is, and she gets instructions from the designer of the Titanic of where the jail would be. And she kind of gets turned around, and you have that, like, sense of being disorientated and being right there with her. I really like that part.
Yeah, and I think that this is an excellent, way of communicating that what it was like for all the people who were below decks in Titanic in the third class, where it was a very disorienting. There were all these little tiny hallways. There were all of these like wrong turns and stairwells and stuff, that it was probably very very scary. And that's what happened to a lot of people, is they just got lost and they couldn't figure out how to get above decks, as the ship started sinking. An important like thing about the Titanic with these bulkheads, the watertight bulkheads, they go up to E deck, but what that means is that when the doors are closed, there's no way to get from each section. If you're looking at the Titanic as a hot dog and you cut it into little, centimeter pieces, there's no way to get from each section to the one next to it without going up and down. You can't go side to side. You have to go up to go over.
Right.
Um, and so it was easy for you to get stuck in an area that still hadn't flooded, but all of your egresses had been flooded at that point. And that's something that we see Jack and Rose go up against time and time again.
Right, because when they hit the iceberg, they end up closing all of the watertight passages on the ship, not
Yeah,
just
as
the
you're supposed
ones,
to do.
yeah, yeah, not just the ones that are affected. So it affects everyone. I did want to bring up the scene of the coal men when they're escaping from the bottom of the ship, and that is horrifying. That is scary. That's the big metal doors slowly closing in, and it looks like it'll crush them. That's just awful. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, that's particularly terrible, but that is also, not necessarily, accurate to what would have been like in the ship. Um, the they didn't need to go through those doors because, as I just said, that the the way to get out is up, and throughout those boiler rooms there would have been ladders, there would have been stairs, there would have been
Right.
all those kinds of things. The first boiler room in the first two, the areas that had already flooded, I mean, they were fucked no matter what. Um but yeah, and the coal, and yeah, it was not ideal to be in the boiler room. But I mean, we just did a whole podcast about nuclear power, or not, we didn't do a whole podcast. We talked about nuclear power last week, and coal, disgusting.
Oh
Being
yeah.
in those boiler rooms for any amount of time, terrible.
So throughout the film, as the water starts to climb through the Titanic, it is clear, cold, brutal. But if you were, in one of the coal rooms, there's no way that water would be clear. There's no way you could, duck under and see all sorts of soot and oils and gross shit would be in there. Like it would be a totally different thing to try to like swim through that section.
Oh yeah, that would be disgusting. And I think that the clearness of the water in the movie was also, a thematic or film, a cinematic effect. I think that the water in the Titanic as it flooded would have been pretty gross generally.
Yeah, we don't even get to see like the water pressure bathrooms being backwards and not working anymore, and like those sort of things being flooded out, or
Gross.
anything like that. Yeah, we don't get that gross in this movie.
Yeah, so after this, so I would say that the only really impossible thing that happens between Jack and Rose in the whole movie is Rose actually hitting his handcuffs with the axe.
Yes, because she closes her eyes when she swings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, whatever. You could probably do it with your eyes closed, like fine. But like the odds of her actually hitting the thing instead of his hands, like, I would have maimed somebody.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah.
terrible.
With the shining parallel I mentioned earlier, he could have lost his hand. Could have turned
Hmm.
into a Saw movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad they didn't do that, but at the same time, like, couldn't she have just found a key, you know?
Yeah, I think it would have been just as fine if she, would have found a key or something like that. But we need Rose becomes like the action hero in that moment where she goes off, finds a solution to her problems, and executes.
Yeah.
She doesn't have the man um come and help her. That's he's carrying like a bunch of life jackets. When he doesn't help her, she punches him in the face. Like
Right.
she becomes the action star with agency and star power that she has earned at this point in the film.
Yeah, I think that's really significant because, as opposed to most, like, I know she is not a manic pixie dream girl, but she's at this moment, she is a woman who is saving a man as opposed to a man saving a woman,
Yeah,
and
she
that is
is
important.
she is never the damsel in distress.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, she puts herself in terrible, distressful situations, but
She
she
never
does help
demands a
herself
man,
out.
yeah,
Yeah.
to help her out of it. Well, I guess
Yeah.
until the end, but that was her last hope. That's how we get the movie. But
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so Leonardo DiCaprio is now freed from prison. Rose is by his side, and they go on to try to make their way to safety.
Yeah, so they break through the some doors and into the third class area, and they manage to find their way up to a gate where they're not letting people through, even though there's lots of women and children down there. Um, these gates on the real Titanic, to make you feel better about all this, these gates didn't actually exist, so that's good. But they do a great job of, you know, solidifying that class warfare situation in the Titanic.
Absolutely, and I think because we talked about this scene a little bit before we recorded, but that adds so much to the claustrophobia, the miscommunication, the terror that, these people were experiencing. You could have ended up with a human crush, um, but they have the moment where they pull a bench off of the floorboards and just use it as a battering ram to have their own salvation.
Yeah. Yeah, and so they make it up to the decks, and then they're seeing when they get up to the decks, they're like, "Holy crap, the ship is really sinking at this point." So most of the lifeboats have left, but I think they actually Cal and Lovejoy find them at this point and
Yes.
convince Rose to get in a lifeboat.
Yes, and then as it's being so Cal gives her his jacket, which he had money and the diamond in, gives it to her. She gets into a boat, and then it goes down to one of the lower decks, and Rose is like, "Nope, I'm getting off." And she goes and finds DiCaprio again in the staircase and says, the phrase that he uttered when they first met, you jump, I jump. We're in this together.
Yeah, and I think that, this is again her saying no to the life with Cal and no to all of that. And of course, moving the plot along. But again, it's one of those, implausible moments of somebody jumping back on the Titanic. But at the same time, they had just shown a lot of very sweet romantic moments between couples who were parting. And saying their goodbyes. And I think that this is the time where we have the older couple. He was a real guy, or they were.
I
The like
got it
owner of
open.
Macy's. Yeah,
Yes, I want to say that's correct
Ismay. No, not Ismay.
on the Wikipedia. Uh, Isidore.
Strauss. There we go.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so they, say like, no, I'm not leaving without you. Um, I'm going to I want to die with you. Because they'd been together for 40 years or whatever. So
yeah, and then
that's
they have a final scene together where they're in bed and the waters break through. Um,
yeah, which is just terrifying.
oh yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
I imagine, dying with somebody you love is important and all, but like, ugh,
Well, I think it
not a good
goes
way to go.
it goes to expand on this idea of the romance of Titanic is far beyond just Jack and Rose, these fictional characters. There was tons of love and camaraderie between so many different people on board that it only further adds to the tragedy of what happened. And
Yeah.
it gives people more to connect to.
Yeah. Yeah, so all these different stages of relationships, there's a man saying goodbye to his daughters. There's this older couple. There's John Jacob Astor. There's or Guggenheim when he's like, we're here dressed in our best and prepared to go down with the rest or something like that. Um, so like there's a connection point for all the viewers who are watching this, where they can see somebody like them or somebody like their loved one who is either getting on a lifeboat or not at this point in the movie.
Yes. So Rose and Jack meet back up together in the grand staircase, and Cal and Lovejoy share a small scene where he explains, Rose has the diamond, it was in my jacket, and I felt like we didn't need that line because we've been following the diamond as the MacGuffin of the story. It sets up why Old Lady Rose goes and is telling this story. It's a big point. I feel like the audience should be rewarded by keeping up with where it is during the tragedy. And,
Mm, I
you
don't
know,
know. I liked that line. I put the diamond in the coat and I put the coat on her, because it is the final like de dehumanizing a point for Cal and her. Like he at that point, she's just the girl who has the diamond. He doesn't care about her anymore. Um,
okay.
Yeah, so I liked that. And honestly, I had not been following the diamond around like it's an Ocean's 11 movie. So,
Okay, I mean, if you frame it in that context, as that line being like, the almost the nail in the coffin to his character, yeah.
yeah.
Because in the next scene, he's chasing after them with a gun.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's him wanting to destroy both of them for ruining his life. Because I think that he sees that, I've lost the diamond, I've lost the girl, I might lose my life. I'm like, this is terrible. I'm going to try and hurt them, in this moment of anger.
And a part of me truthfully believes that he'll get away with it. Like if
Yeah.
he shoots these people, there's so much chaos, nobody is gonna go,
Yeah, nobody cares.
you're a murderer. Yeah,
And he's the kind of guy that would be above the law no matter what anyway.
right.
And, as characters' motivations go, again, I have no fault with Cal for the decisions that he makes. Like this is a sensible decision to, be angry at these people. And, maybe if he can, shoot one of them, then he can get the diamond out of the coat and, beat her up or whatever. Because I mean, these people have ruined his life. So, that all makes sense to me. The reasoning for Lovejoy to follow along with this bullshit and not get in the lifeboat is stupid. And that's something that I think we see is an interesting thing that we see from a lot of characters who are servants or crew members is that they don't get in the lifeboats. They don't save themselves. Um, and that's like, yes, it can be cowardly, but like Rose's maid Trudy, you see her die at some point, or fall and probably die. So like, why didn't she get in the lifeboat? Why didn't Lovejoy pay to get in the lifeboat,
Right, right. He would definitely have the same means that Hal did to bribe his way on.
Yeah, or he could have just killed Cal and taken his money, like we're getting to the point in the movie where decisions are life and death, and having your employer tell you to do something at this point is not something that I would go along with.
Right. Yeah, it starts to break down a little bit, and it could, have added to the theme of, Rose having agency and these life-altering experiences, giving people a new lease on life for Lovejoy to just go, dude, I don't care. I'm getting off. I'm leaving
Yeah,
now. Goodbye.
yeah,
Like, working for
yeah,
you sucked.
yeah. In a similar to the speech that Murdoch gives that, your money can't save you any more than it can save me. Like, I think that's, I'm surprised that that didn't happen with Lovejoy, but henchman got a hench, I guess.
Yeah. I do think we should bring up Murdoch and the fact that he's shown to like take this bribe and to, put some men above others, and then he ends up shooting someone, and then taking his own life. Most of that is all fictionalized. It
Hmm.
didn't really happen, and James Cameron ended up going to where Murdoch was from and giving money to a scholarship that existed in his name and apologizing for his depiction in the film to the descendants of his family as a means to uh, right that wrong. Uh,
Yeah,
Anytime we have movies that are based on historical events, we obviously have to take liberties in how some of the characters are portrayed. And in the event where we do wrong by them, I think it's important that we rectify that or
yeah,
just
and
don't do wrong by them.
well, and that's a very like that that's a very good thing that they did, and I'm glad that they did that. At the same time, I think that having this officer who was more likable than the other one, who was, women and children only, um, even if the lifeboats are empty, women and children only. Um, I think that, Murdoch is generally the more likable officer, and, in the grand scheme of things, there aren't so many officers that we are on a first name basis with,
Right.
in this film, which is good because I have a problem with, especially with period dramas where, you put all the men in a uniform and give them the same hat, and I'm like, nope, they're all the same guy. I can't tell the difference. So, and even watching this movie 1,000 times, some of the officers do tend to blend together.
Yeah,
So having
that's true.
him go through that emotional moment of regret and suicide is I think it's a great scene. And I think that it speaks to a lot of things that were probably happening on the Titanic, but not necessarily recorded. At this point, there's only a few lifeboats left on the boat. The people who are in the lifeboats are pretty far away. If somebody shot themselves on the deck, no, people might not, the people who live might not know that.
Right.
So we don't necessarily know how many people did this. I mean, I know you said earlier that that would be your plan if you were
Yeah,
stuck on the lifeboat or stuck on the boat.
right. Because at this point, the Titanic is sinking pretty fast. It's, people are sliding into the water. People are jumping from the decks to swim to the lifeboats. At a certain point, you got to go, I'm not going to make it. And I
Yeah.
feel like drowning, awful. Freezing to death, awful. Gun, at least that's on your own volition. And I think, reports would indicate that that's something people did.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something people did. I have to imagine that a lot of the first class passengers who, realized that they weren't going to make it, like they had weapons and used them. The officers all had weapons. Um, the third class passengers probably didn't. Maybe they used other means, knives and that kind of thing at that point. If I had kids and this was happening, I would have smothered them, you know. Um,
Yeah, we
and I mean, as grim as this is, we're talking about infanticide here. Better than watching your children drown.
Yes, uh, absolutely. This movie gets very horrific very fast. Um,
Yeah, it is
is
dark at times.
Yes, especially once the boat splits in two and the stern goes into the air.
Yes,
Okay.
the stern rises upward.
Yes, because when that happens, we see tons of people sliding down the deck to their doom. We see people falling forward and being pulled by gravity. We see one of the smokestacks break free of its restraints and crush Leonardo DiCaprio's friend, who we've been following throughout the rest of the movie.
Yeah,
Um,
Fabrizio.
Fabrizio, yes. Um, just awful, horrific ways to go.
Yeah, yeah, and applause to James Cameron for casting and the casting director for casting a non-white person in the role of Leonardo DiCaprio's best friend.
Yeah, yeah.
It's strange for the 90s.
Yeah, a little bit. There was a lot of cultural representation in this movie that I think might have been able to go
Yeah,
further. But
yeah, there were some Indian folks on the Titanic. There was and I don't think we see any of the Asian passengers, but Fabrizio's Italian, and Italian back then in a lot of the literature about Titanic and the like news stories afterward, the Italians tend to be the butt of a lot of jokes as part of the Titanic experience, which is not a good thing. It's very sad. Racism is never cool, but even if Fabrizio is, Italian, might be considered white now, it wasn't then.
yeah, it was a
So
much
so
different time.
having that, like this American's best friend is an Italian, what the heck? So Yeah, I liked that as a detail, but his story ends very sadly.
Right. Um, and their other friend, the Irishman, who ends up getting shot in one of the scuffles on deck, that's also just as sad.
Hmm.
So Jack and Rose are able to hold on to their lives as they hold on to the uh, stern of the ship where Rose tried to jump from earlier in the film. Again, another one of those parallels of we're seeing these characters in the same places with similar actions, but for much different meanings. Here, they're
Yes.
holding on for dear life, whereas before they were ready to let go.
Yeah.
We're also introduced to another real person who was on the Titanic, who was a chef who was very drunk and continues to drink all the way down. Um,
Yeah.
Another one of the legends that
Yes.
exists.
And his story is very much the way that they based, Jack and Rose's figuring out how to live. They based it on his story of escape, where he, climbed to the bow of the ship and he used alcohol in order to stave off some of the hypothermia. And I think in his account, he said that he was able to drop into the water without getting his hair wet, was his words.
I've
Um,
heard that. That sounds very fanciful.
Very
Um,
fanciful, but I think it gets the point across that was his plan. The other thing that's important too is they mention a lot in the discourse about, rowing away because of the suction. But Titanic didn't actually have much suction when she went down, and I think that's largely because as the stern sinks, it is the water pressure inside is very much exploding everything
right.
outward. So if you were, trapped in the stern of the ship for whatever reason, you were probably exploded. So you wouldn't have felt a lot.
Well, that's
Comforting.
sure. So once Jack and Rose get in the water, it is a mad dash. Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't have on a life jacket, so he clings to Rose and ends up getting separated. Rose then gets grabbed onto by someone else who doesn't have a life jacket, and he nearly drowns her.
Hmm.
And uh,
Horrifying.
yeah, it's absolutely scary. In the commotion, then Jack resurfaces and is able to cling on to Rose in the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic, and they are able to find a piece of wood.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, so they both try to get on the piece of wood and they
yes,
don't make it and they
correct.
it flips over.
Yes,
So it is clear to me as a Titanic enthusiast that they couldn't both be on the piece of wood.
yes, I agree. They couldn't both get onto the piece of wood. However, if Leonardo DiCaprio had activated the no clipping cheat code and was able to change his position to be on top, they both could have fit on it. But the problem was being able to get up onto it. There is a lot of discourse about the size of this piece of wood and the amount of space and occupancy it could have. Um,
Yeah, and so the real, the fundamental scientific, reason here is that yes, the piece of wood was large enough for both of them, but it was not buoyant enough, which was the problem.
Science.
Science. And there's a look in Jack's face when he realizes that he can't get on the piece of wood, and it is a almost a resignation to his fate. Like he knows
But
at that
he
point.
but he is so reassuring of her because it matters to her that they're going to be okay. He's like,
Yeah.
oh, the boats are going to come back. They're just waiting because, the suction, they don't know it's gone down yet. And, it'll take a while to muster. There is a officer who's blowing his whistle, signaling, guys come back. Uh, it's there is and there is hope there.
Yeah. and yeah, there's hope, and then it all starts to quiet down, and Jack and Rose have a, important but difficult conversation where he is doing it again, and motivating her not to give up, and to, live on, and to promise him that she is going to make it through this, that his sacrifice in not being on the piece of wood is not in vain, that she's going to make it and die an old woman alone in her bed. Um, and that's another like really well written speech.
Yes, and Jack really thinks he made it count. He made all of the sacrifices he made tonight. The fact that Rose saved him from drowning earlier, that like all of the experiences of the past few days have made it worth saving her and having her go on to have a life.
Hmm. And to
Because
live the life that she is dreaming about.
yes, exactly. Because before they met, she wouldn't have had a life worth living like she would
Hmm.
now.
Yeah, yeah,
Afterwards, they tie some boats together, and a single boat goes back to try to wade through the wreckage to get anybody that's still alive. Rose tries to wake Jack up, but Jack has succumbed to hypothermia or frozen to death or something, and she is unable to get his attention. And we see him drift off and fall through the waves to an ocean grave. Um, and then she swims over to the officer who had a whistle and gets that so she can alert the ship that is now leaving because she wasn't able to scream for help. And she is able to get them with the whistle and is brought on board and regains consciousness once they get to the deck of the boat that rescues her.
yeah. That's that.
And we have really one final scene in the flashback of Rose being on the ship, and she takes Jack's last name, so she is now Rose Dawson, and that's one of the names that we learned earlier on in the film was a Rose who was able to, uh, or that's the name she uses early on in the film as Old Rose's name, and
Yeah, so she abandons her, first class identity for, the, wife of Jack, and embarks on her life. And she also sees Cal walk by, who's looking for her, which I think is interesting too. Like he's looking for her. I mean, maybe he's looking for the diamond, but he lives for various reasons because he's a jerk. But
right,
so
we didn't touch on that, and I think this is something I wrote down that was important in my notes. So Cal is able to get a space on the lifeboat because he picks up a random child and says to one of the officers or whatever that I'm the only person this little girl has. I have to leave too, and they let him on. Whereas
yeah,
earlier in the film, mere moments before, he sees this child and completely ignores her.
yeah, but he sees it as a ticket in order to get to where he
Yes,
needs to go. And, to be fair, also, he then was pivotal in getting that boat, going in the right direction too.
right.
So, I feel like I'm being a Cal apologist today. This is terrible. I
Well,
never wanted to be in that position.
no. Well, I mean, it's a perspective. But earlier in that same time when Rose and Jack are escaping, they see a child screaming in the hallway, and they do not hesitate to come to its rescue. Um,
Hmm.
that turns out to be in vain because the father takes the child, and they ended up getting sucked into, one of the water traps, and they weren't able to escape. But it is this idea that the lower class has this solidarity to not only stick together but help each other out, whereas the rich only are going to save you to save themselves.
Yeah.
Um, just
Yeah.
I thought that that was an excellent. No words needed to be spoken to explain that scene, those scenes, and how they parallel each other for you to understand.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And yeah, and then we get to the ending of the film where elderly female Rose finishes the story. Most of the characters are in tears that have been listening to it. She goes on to say that she didn't, ever tell this story because it was hers. It was something
Hmm.
that she had, and it didn't need to be anybody else's.
Yeah, and the pivotal quote that she says there is, he saved me in every way that a person could be saved. And I think that that is such a moving statement. I mean, we talked about agency and we talked about, like, oh, damsel in distress. And while she is saying that literally, she is also saying that he saved me from being an agentless, you know, uh, just, rich, boring person too. Um, and in addition to actually saving her life, stopping her from committing suicide, stopping her from, dying in the Titanic various times, um, that, you know, being a damsel in distress and being saved is not necessarily a bad thing if you are able to positively change after that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's very much the messaging there. And I think it's a great capstone to this love story of falling in love and becoming yourself and coming of age and following it almost like, oh my God, Garrett, I'm making a Dune reference. It's almost like she did everything that she could to avoid um the prescribed future, you know? Like if
Yes.
she had a vision of the future, she was doing everything that she could to make sure that didn't come true and to create a different future for herself.
Right.
All comes back to Dune, everything.
Everything comes full circle. So, what did we learn?
Oh my gosh.
Uh, Man's hubris knows no bounds. Um,
Man's hubris knows no bounds.
if you decide you're going to build the biggest, most luxurious, and greatest, grandest boat, I assure you it can be destroyed. If you decide you want to go down on a submarine and look at that boat, well, you can make the biggest blockbuster that people don't have faith in, and it becomes the most successful thing in the world. Or you can die a explosive death.
Yeah, there's really only two options there. Either become famous and make an amazing piece of art, or die immediately with your little PlayStation controller.
Yeah. So right now, at the time of watching, Titanic is on Netflix and it is in the number 4 position and in trending. And I believe that is due in part by the Ocean Gate submarine disaster of 2023, where a rich billionaire with a lot of hubris and a machine that wasn't built up to snuff and ignored by scientists and people alike, that has been imploded on the seafloor.
It has. And the interesting thing here is that this was a terribly poorly thought out plan. The ship was terrible. The submarine was just terrible. And I think most people who looked at the submarine also thought it was terrible, and they're like, I'm not getting in that. James Cameron, looked at it and laughed at it. Um, and but all of these people wanted to go see Titanic, and
Yes.
they were happy to go see it in this little tiny window and see it on computer screen images, which I don't understand at all. Like, if the images of Titanic that I'm going to see in the submarine are the same as the images that I could see from the boat, I would take the boat. How about
Yes,
you?
I'm staying on the boat.
Yeah, like my proximity to the Titanic does not improve the quality of the images.
No.
And knowing how much work and how much money that James Cameron and that team put into going and visiting the Titanic, and all of the teams that have done so since in bringing up treasure and stuff like that. The whole discovery of the Titanic was took a very long time, and it was fraught with many issues, including the discovery of several classified submarine accidents, I think.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think I didn't research this. I just heard it in a podcast, so it might not be true at all. Um,
I'll put a fact check. Hi, this is Garrett in post-production. So, as it turns out, the U.S. Navy in 1984 was already looking for sunken nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, which are both really cool names. They were then used at a later point to continue looking for the Titanic.
yeah, yeah. So the Ocean Gate, I guess the thing that we learned from Ocean Gate is the allure of Titanic and how strong it is that people would risk their lives in such a way to see it and be close to it.
Yeah, truly wanting to be a part of this history of this event is a draw for so many people.
Yeah, and it's strange to me too because I mean, I obviously Titanic enthusiast, Titanic obsessed person right here, but I mean, I guess there are plenty of other shipwrecks that I would visit before I visited Titanic. And maybe all the people on Ocean Gate had already visited them, or maybe they didn't care at all. But yeah, like the allure and the need to be on Titanic and or to be there is, I mean, even a Titanic obsessed person such as myself does not quite understand this.
Yeah, I don't understand it hardly at all. I mean, it's interesting, sure. I'm sure there's stuff we can learn, but the risks are not worth it to me. It's
Yeah.
very scary. The ocean's a scary place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, the ocean is to me, I mean, you could not pay me enough money to get in a submarine, and you also could not pay me enough money to get in a spaceship unless like maybe the world was exploding or something. Um, but space is a lot safer than the ocean. So, eh,
yeah, yeah. You know, at the end of the day, this comes down to we're all on a ship that's sinking, and we all need to save them. But every man for himself isn't going to get anything done.
no, we need to start building a lifeboat, Garrett.
Do we need permits for that?
I think we need a Patreon fund. That's what we need.
Yeah, so if you want to send us money to build a spaceship to escape global warming, you can do that.
Yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
scientist. You're an artist. I'm sure we could make the Titanic of the stars.
No, it's called the Titanic lifeboat.
Okay, okay.
Of the stars, Titanic lifeboat of the stars. This
Titanic.
sounds like almost like a reality TV show. I don't know about this. Gonna have to work on the name. It's a work in progress.
Well, I don't have anything more to add.
I mean, I could literally talk about this for the rest of my life, so I guess you gotta cut me off sometime.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us on this longer episode where we were able to, I think, really give some good insights on what this movie means, what it means to fans, what it means to people who have just seen it for the first time, to understand a little bit more of the scenes and to really talk about what it all means. And as a disaster movie, to understand the real implications and the care and attention that was put into this.
Yeah, it's a great movie made by people who really did their homework, and I'm glad I got to spend however many hours this ends up being talking about it, because it really is my favorite movie, and I'm happy to share that and also come up with some new ideas. It's interesting to me to watch a movie that you've seen many times and to think about it more critically, and that's certainly something that I did with this. And I hope that some of the ideas that we brought to the table were interesting and unique and maybe something you hadn't thought before when you watched Titanic the first 99 times.
Yeah, and I'm 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 very glad I got to see this and talk to you about it, and that I wasn't completely off base with a lot of the things that I talked about.
Yeah, no, this was great.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye.